We finally know the real reason Doris Day had no funeral or grave marker. When Doris Day died on May 13, 2019, at her home in Carmel Valley, California, Hollywood expected a grand farewell. She was 97 years old and had been America's sweetheart for more than 6 decades. Instead, there was silence. No service. No headstone. No place for fans to leave flowers. Her own foundation announced it plainly: no funeral, no memorial, and no grave marker. Friends wishing to remember her were directed to her animal charity's website instead. Some said it was her deep love of animals. Others pointed to how Martin Melcher had stolen roughly $20 million from her, souring her on the industry forever. Her manager and close friend Bob Bashara hinted she was simply a very shy person who never understood why the world loved her so much. But people who truly knew her believed the answer ran darker and deeper than any of those explanations. It was tied to her son Terry, to Charles Manson, and to a guilt she carried quietly for the rest of her life. To understand why, you have to go back to where she started. Doris Mary Kappelhoff was born on April 3, 1922, in Cincinnati, Ohio, already into a family that knew grief. Her parents had lost their first son, Richard, in 1919, just 2 years after his birth. By the time Doris arrived, sorrow had already settled quietly into the house. Her father, a music teacher, later had an affair with one of her mother's close friends, and the family fell apart. In 1932, when Doris was only 10, her parents divorced, a shameful thing in their German-American community. She and her brother stayed with their mother, who worked at a small bakery to keep them afloat. Long before she was famous, she had already learned what it meant to be left behind. Dance became her escape. By 12, she had formed a duo with a neighborhood boy named Jerry Doherty, and by 14, they had won a citywide contest that sent them to Hollywood for 4 weeks of professional training. The prize was $500, enormous during the Depression. She signed with a casting company and planned to move to Los Angeles. Her future felt close enough to touch. Then, on October 13, 1937, the car she was riding in near Hamilton, Ohio was struck by a freight train. Her right leg was shattered in a double compound fracture, broken through the skin in 2 places. 14 to 18 months of surgery, traction, and recovery followed. Her dancing career was finished before it ever properly began. Lying in bed with nowhere to go, she turned to the radio. Big band voices filled the room: Benny Goodman, Glenn Miller, Tommy Dorsey, and among all of them, it was Ella Fitzgerald's voice that reached her differently. She listened, sang along, and discovered, slowly, that music could take her somewhere dance no longer could. Her mother enrolled her in vocal lessons with Coach Grace Rain. By 1939, she was performing on local radio and in small clubs, billed for the first time as Doris Day, a name suggested by bandleader Barney Rapp because of how often she sang the song day after day. By 1945, singing with Les Brown's band, she scored 2 back-to-back #1 hits. Sentimental Journey reached the top of the charts on March 29, 1945, and stayed there for 9 weeks. As American troops came home from World War II, that song became their unofficial anthem. The girl from Cincinnati, who had nearly lost everything to a freight train, was suddenly everywhere. But behind that warm public voice was a private life already marked by violence. At 19, she had married trombonist Al Jordan in March 1941, against her mother's protests. 2 days after the wedding, he beat her senseless in their New York apartment because she had kissed a bandmate on the cheek as thanks for a wedding gift. What followed were 2 years of terror, public humiliation, gun threats, and brutal physical abuse. When she refused his demand that she abort their unborn child, he beat her while she was pregnant. At 8 months along, he slammed her into walls and left her bruised with a swollen eye. She stayed as long as she did because of the baby. On February 8, 1942, Terry Paul Jordan was born healthy, and she later called him her wonderful gain from that nightmare. By February 1943, she had forced Al out, locked the doors, and escaped with Terry to her mother's home. Terry became the center of her world. And it was Terry who would bring the darkest chapter of her life 26 years later. By the late 1960s, her son had grown into a successful record producer who helped shape the California sound, working with the Byrds in co-writing the Beach Boys' hit Kokomo. Through Beach Boys bandmate Dennis Wilson, Terry crossed paths with Charles Manson, an aspiring musician who was shopping himself around Hollywood. Terry attended one of Manson's informal auditions, but quickly sensed something deeply wrong. He described the scene as filthy and said he had felt only one thing: he needed to get out. He rejected Manson's request for a recording contract and tried to make a graceful exit. At the time, Terry was living with his girlfriend Candice Bergen at a home on Cielo Drive in Benedict Canyon. Manson had been there. He had come to the house more than once. And when Terry told his mother what he had seen, the knives Manson brandished, the vacant-eyed followers, the strange menace that hung over everything, Doris insisted her son move out. Beach Boys frontman Mike Love later wrote in his memoir that the decision was no accident. According to Love, it was Doris Day's instinct as a mother, and it may have saved her son's life. Terry and Bergen moved out in January 1969. Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski signed the lease on February 12 and moved in on February 15. Then, on the night of August 8 into August 9, 1969, Manson's followers invaded that house and murdered everyone inside. Sharon Tate, 8 months pregnant, was stabbed 16 times. Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, Wojciech Frykowski, and Stephen Parent were also killed. The brutality shocked the entire country. For Doris and Terry, it was something more personal and more haunting. He had lived in that house. His name had been tied to Manson's rage. Whether Manson knew Terry had already moved is something investigators debated for years, but the terror felt real regardless. Manson's followers had even left a note at Terry's Malibu residence, proving they knew exactly where he was. After the murders, Terry never recovered his sense of safety. He hired bodyguards and underwent psychiatric treatment. He refused to discuss Manson in almost any setting. When events were held for Doris, he hired 7 deputies and a sergeant to provide security and insisted they appear in every photograph taken of her. At the Manson trial, prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi described Terry as the most frightened witness in the entire case. Near the end of Terry's life, dying of melanoma in Beverly Hills on November 19, 2004, he reportedly whispered one question to those around him: had Sharon Tate's family ever forgiven him? That single question says everything about the weight he carried for 35 years. Doris carried it too. On top of that grief sat the financial betrayal she had never fully healed from. After Martin Melcher's sudden death in 1968, she discovered he and attorney Jerome Rosenthal had quietly drained the fortune she had spent 2 decades building across 39 films and more than 650 songs. Nearly $20 million was gone, moved through failing hotels, oil deals, and hidden investments. She hadn't signed any of it. Rosenthal had forged her name. Before he died, Melcher had also signed her to a television series without her knowledge or consent. She had never wanted to do television. She was grieving and financially ruined, but she had no choice. She later sued Rosenthal, and after a 99-day trial, won a judgment in 1974. She eventually settled with insurers for $6 million in 1977. The victory mattered, but the damage to her trust in other people never fully repaired. By the end, she had survived more than most people could imagine: a train crash that stole her first dream, 2 years of domestic terror, public betrayal, financial ruin, and the near loss of her only child to a serial killer's grudge. She withdrew into the quiet of Carmel Valley, surrounded by dogs, living at a remove from the Hollywood that had taken so much from her. Her manager Bob Bashara said she had genuine difficulty accepting death. She couldn't even be present when her animals had to be put down. She simply couldn't face it. And so she planned a departure that required no one to face it either: no service, no ceremony, no stone with her name on it. She was cremated and her ashes were scattered. When her foundation announced her death, it pointed people toward her animal charity, the last thing in her life she had trusted completely. The woman the world remembered as sunlight and optimism had decided, quietly and firmly, that she didn't want a monument. She had already seen how permanent things could disappear overnight. The real reason there was no funeral was never simply grief or modesty. It was the accumulated weight of everything she had survived and everything she had been unable to stop. America never really knew the woman behind the smile. She made sure, in the end, that they never would.